They say freedom is something you fight for, but what if you were trained to fight before you understood what freedom meant? I was not born into chains, yet chains were the first thing I knew. My name is Thrall. It means slave in the human tongue. That was not an insult. It was my identity, given to me before I could speak, before I could question, before I understood that names were supposed to reflect who you are rather than what you are owned to become. I was not born a leader. I was raised as a weapon, and for most of my childhood, I did not know there was a difference. My earliest memory is not of my mother's face or my father's voice. It is of cold, the kind of cold that enters through your skin and settles in your bones. A cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with absence. I was an infant when the humans came to Durnhold Keep, carried in the arms of a warlord who was already dead by the time I arrived. My father, Duratan, chieftain of the Frostwolf clan, had been murdered along with my mother Draka in the snow outside Alterac. Their bodies were left to freeze while I was taken as a curiosity, a spoil of war too young to be dangerous. Aedelas Blackmore found me there, a human lieutenant with ambitions that exceeded his station and a cruelty that matched his vision. He saw in an orphaned orc infant not a tragedy but an opportunity. The Horde had been defeated. The internment camps were filling with broken warriors who had lost their bloodlust along with their freedom. But I was young enough to be shaped, young enough to be taught human language, human tactics, human obedience, young enough to become what Blackmore imagined, a trained orc who could command other orcs, a weapon that would elevate him from minor noble to power broker in the Alliance military structure. I do not remember being chosen for this purpose. I only remember that purpose was always present, a weight I carried before I understood what weight was. The fortress of Durnhold Keep became my world. Its stone walls, its training yards, its cells and corridors defined the boundaries of existence. I learned to walk on stones worn smooth by generations of human feet. I learned to speak words designed for human mouths, struggling with sounds my tusks made awkward. I learned that the world was divided into two categories of being, those who gave orders and those who obeyed them. I was taught which category I belonged to with methodical consistency. Blackmore did not raise me himself. That task fell to Taretha Foxton, daughter of one of Durnhold's servants, a girl only a few years older than I who became both my teacher and my only source of something approaching kindness. She brought me books when she was supposed to bring only food. She spoke to me as if I were capable of understanding concepts beyond combat commands. She treated me, in small moments when no one was watching, as if I were a child rather than a project. But Taretha's kindness existed in the spaces between Blackmore's training, and the training was relentless. I was 4 years old when I first held a weapon designed for killing. Not a practice blade or a wooden sword, but a real axe, its edge sharp enough to split wood or bone with equal efficiency. My hands were too small to grip it properly. Blackmore did not care. He placed it in my palms and told me to swing. When I failed to lift it high enough, he struck me across the face and told me to swing again. When I dropped it from exhaustion, he struck me again and told me to pick it up. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was education. This was how one taught a weapon to function. The philosophy was simple. Pain taught faster than praise. Fear motivated better than encouragement. A student who trained to avoid punishment would train harder than one who trained for approval. Blackmore had observed this in dogs and horses. He applied the same principles to me with scientific precision. Each failure resulted in immediate correction. Each success was met with increased difficulty. There was no plateau of acceptable performance, only an endless escalation of expectation. I learned to fight before I learned to read, though eventually Taretha would teach me both. The combat training followed a specific progression. First, endurance. Long runs through the fortress grounds in weighted training harness. Swimming in the cold waters of Lord Emir's tributaries until my muscles seized. carrying stones from one end of the courtyard to the other, then back again, then again, until the sunset made it too dark to see and still continuing in darkness. The goal was not strength, though strength came. The goal was to teach my body that its limitations were irrelevant, that exhaustion was simply a sensation to be ignored, that physical suffering was the baseline condition of existence rather than an exception. Second, technique. Sword forms practiced 10,000 times until the movements occurred without thought. Spear thrusts repeated until my shoulder ached, and then repeated another 1,000 times beyond that ache. Wrestling matches against the fortress guards, full-grown human soldiers who showed no mercy to a child because Blackmore had ordered them to show none. I lost these matches, every single one of them for the first 2 years. Each loss was recorded, each failure analyzed, each weakness identified and then targeted in the next day's training. Third, pain tolerance. This was the most systematic portion of my education. Blackmore understood that warriors who could function through injury were more valuable than warriors who could avoid injury. So I was taught to fight while hurt, deliberately hurt, in controlled ways that would not cause permanent damage but would simulate battlefield conditions. A blade cut across the forearm before practice, a boot to the ribs before sparring. The lesson was clear. Your body will fail you, will betray you with its weakness and its nerves that scream for you to stop. You must learn to function regardless. By age 6, I could defeat any of Durnhold's guards in single combat. This was not because I was naturally gifted, though my orcish physiology gave me advantages in strength and resilience. This was because I had been given no alternative. Victory was the baseline expectation. Defeat resulted in consequences that made future defeat unthinkable. So I learned to win. Not through inspiration or competitive spirit, but through the simple calculus that winning hurt less than losing. The other children of Durnhold watched these training sessions from the fortress walls. I could see them pointing, laughing sometimes, other times simply staring with the fascination humans reserve for dangerous animals. I did not understand their laughter. I did not understand why they were permitted to watch without participating. The concept of childhood as a separate category of existence, a time of play and protection, was not something I had been taught. I knew only training, only preparation for purpose. Taretha tried to explain it to me once. She was perhaps 10 years old. I was 6. We sat in the small room where she brought my meals, and she attempted to describe what normal children did. They played games, she said. They invented stories. They explored the forest without mission or destination. They laughed without having earned the privilege through performance. I listened to her description the way I would later listen to descriptions of distant continents or alien species. Intellectually, I could process the information. Emotionally, it held no reference point in my own experience. "Do you wish you could play?" she asked me. I considered the question carefully. Wishing implied desiring something beyond your current circumstance. Desiring implied you had the right to want circumstances different from what authority had designated. Both concepts felt dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and contemplating jumping not because you intended to jump, but simply because the possibility existed. "I do not know what play is," I finally answered. "How can I wish for something I cannot understand?" She looked at me with an expression I had learned to recognize as sadness, though I did not understand why my honest answer would produce that response. Later, I would realize she was mourning something on my behalf, mourning the childhood I was not having while I lacked the framework to mourn it myself. Blackmore's methods were more sophisticated than simple brutality. He understood that weapons needed to be reliable, and reliability required more than fear. It required belief. A dog beaten into submission would obey, but it would also seek opportunity to escape. A dog trained to believe its purpose was noble, that its suffering served a greater good, would police its own obedience. So alongside the physical training came the ideological indoctrination. I was taught that orcs were naturally inferior to humans, not as individuals, Blackmore made clear I was exceptional, but as a species. Orcs had invaded Azeroth as mindless destroyers. They had burned villages and slaughtered innocents, not from military necessity, but from bloodthirsty nature. The Horde had been defeated because it deserved defeat, because it represented chaos and destruction, while the Alliance represented order and civilization. These were presented not as opinions, but as historical facts, as natural law, as immutable as gravity. But I was different. I was being elevated above my nature through human guidance. Blackmore was not my owner, but my savior, rescuing me from the fate of the internment camps where broken orcs sat listless and defeated. He was giving me purpose, training, a chance to transcend the limitations of my birth. The proper response to this generosity was gratitude. Absolute, unquestioning gratitude that manifested as absolute, unquestioning obedience. The logic was elegant. It transformed my subordination from oppression into opportunity. It made my suffering into privilege. How could I resent the training that hurt me when that training was the only thing preventing me from becoming like the hollow creatures I sometimes glimpsed being transported to the camps? How could I question orders when those orders were what separated me from bestial nature? This framework was reinforced through carefully controlled exposure to other orcs. Occasionally, Blackmore would take me to observe the internment camps. Not the ones at Durnhold, but others scattered across Lordaeron's territories. I saw orcs who had once been warriors, sitting motionless in mud, their eyes vacant, their bodies wasting despite adequate food. I saw them ignore each other, ignore their surroundings, ignore everything except the basic functions of breathing and eating. They looked like living corpses, animated flesh with nothing inside. This is what orcs become without purpose. Blackmore would tell me, standing just close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. Without direction, without human civilization to give their existence meaning. You could be them, Thrall. This is your natural state. Everything you are, everything you can become, exists only because I chose to train you rather than cage you. I believed him. What choice did I have? I was 7 years old, had never met another orc who spoke, who showed will or intelligence. The evidence before my eyes confirmed everything I was taught. My own existence as a thinking, striving being seemed to prove that human guidance was necessary for orcish potential to manifest. The camps also served another purpose. They were a threat that required no articulation. Obey, perform, meet expectations, or be sent there, to that vacancy, to that living death. The fear was not of death itself. I had been trained to face death without flinching. The fear was of becoming nothing, of existing without purpose, without the structure that defined my every waking moment. So I trained harder. I studied more intensely. I perfected my common until I spoke it better than most humans. I memorized Alliance military doctrine, tactical philosophy, historical campaigns. I learned to analyze battlefield terrain, to calculate supply line vulnerabilities, to predict enemy movement based on terrain and weather. I became what Blackmore intended. A perfect weapon who maintained himself, who sharpened his own edge, who required no external force to compel his obedience because he had internalized the necessity of that obedience so completely. At night, alone in my cell, I was never permitted quarters, always a cell, always stone walls and a locked door. I would recite the things I had learned that day. Not because anyone required it, but because the recitation felt necessary. Because silence felt dangerous. Because in silence, questions could form, and questions led to doubt, and doubt led to the camps. So I filled the silence with repetition, with the reinforcement of my own conditioning. Taratha noticed. She began bringing books that had nothing to do with warfare or Alliance history. Poetry, philosophy, stories about places beyond Lordaeron. She never directly contradicted my training, never suggested that what I was being taught was false. She simply offered alternatives, other ways of thinking that existed alongside the official curriculum. "Why do you bring these?" I asked her once, holding a book about the founding of Dalaran. "Because weapons don't read poetry," she said quietly. "And I don't want you to be just a weapon." I did not understand her answer. I was a weapon. That was my purpose, my identity, the reason I had been permitted to survive when by all rights I should have died with my parents in the snow. Wanting to be something else felt like wanting to be a different species, a different reality. It felt impossible. But I read the books anyway, because... Taretha asked. Because in the small space of our interactions, I was permitted to be something besides Blackmore's project, even if I could not name what that something was. The doubt began not as rejection, but as inconsistency. Small discrepancies between what I was taught and what I observed. Blackmore told me orcs were naturally violent, driven by bloodlust even in captivity. Yet the orcs I saw in the camps showed no violence at all. They showed nothing. If violence was inherent to orcish nature, why did it disappear in captivity? Why did they not fight each other, fight the guards, fight anything? Blackmore's explanation was that they had been broken, defeated so thoroughly that even their violent nature had been suppressed. But I was an orc, raised in captivity, trained from infancy. If violence was genetic, inherent, should I not feel it regardless of training? I searched myself for this bloodlust I was told defined my species. I found only what I had been taught to feel. The controlled aggression of a disciplined warrior, no different from the controlled aggression Blackmore displayed when he was sober and focused. The books Taretha brought raised other questions. They described orcish invasions as desperate, the actions of a people fleeing something worse. They mentioned the corruption of the warlocks, the demonic influence that had twisted the Horde into what it became. These were not excuses. The atrocities remained atrocities regardless of cause. But they suggested that what I had been taught as natural orcish savagery might have been artificially induced, might have been a deviation from orcish nature rather than an expression of it. I could not voice these questions to Blackmore. To question the foundations of my training would be to question my own purpose, my own worth. If orcs were not inherently inferior, then my elevation was not a gift, but simple human decency. If the Alliance's victory was not inevitable justice, then my training to command orcs on behalf of human interests was not salvation, but exploitation. The entire architecture of meaning that had been built around my existence would collapse. So the questions stayed internal, silent. I continued training with absolute dedication, continued learning with perfect focus, but beneath the performance, something had shifted. I began watching the guards differently, analyzing their behavior not just as tactical information, but as evidence. When they spoke of their own childhoods, their own families, I noticed they described experiences nothing like mine. They had been permitted weakness, permitted failure, permitted time to discover what they wanted before being told what they would become. Blackmore drank, heavily and frequently. I had always known this, had learned to read his moods by his walk, to predict his temper by the hour and his consumption. But now I began questioning why someone who was teaching me discipline and control seemed to possess neither himself. He preached stoicism while indulging every appetite. He demanded my perfection while accepting his own profound imperfection. The contradiction had always been present. Now it became impossible to ignore. At age 10, I made my first independent decision, a small one, meaningless in practical terms, but profound in principle. Blackmore had ordered me to train through an injury, a pulled muscle in my leg that made proper stance impossible. I had done this before, had fought through worse, but this time I stopped. I told him the injury needed time to heal properly, that training through it would cause compensatory damage that would reduce my effectiveness in the long term. He struck me. Not unusual, but instead of resuming training immediately as I always had, I waited. I remained still until the blow's impact faded, then calmly repeated my assessment. Training through this specific injury would reduce my combat capability. If my purpose was to be an effective weapon, damaging that weapon through impatience was counterproductive. I was using his own logic against him, framing my refusal not as disobedience but as superior tactical thinking. He could not argue with the reasoning without undermining the entire premise of my training. So he dismissed me, anger clear but impotent. And I felt something I had never felt before. The recognition that I had chosen my own action based on my own assessment, and that choice had mattered. The feeling was terrifying. Because if I could choose in this small matter, it meant I could potentially choose in larger ones. And if I could choose, it meant I had been choosing all along. Choosing to obey, choosing to train, choosing to accept the identity that had been assigned to me. The possibility of choice meant the possibility of responsibility. It meant I was not simply a weapon being wielded, but a being wielding himself according to external direction. It meant I might be complicit in my own subordination. Taretha's role in my development cannot be understated, though I did not understand its significance until much later. She was not simply teaching me to read or bringing me books. She was modeling a relationship that contradicted everything else I knew about human-orc interaction. She treated me as if I possessed inherent worth, independent of my utility. She asked my opinions not to evaluate my training, but because she genuinely wanted to know what I thought. She shared her own fears and frustrations as if I was someone who could understand them, could care about them, could be trusted with vulnerability. This was revolutionary. Every other human in Hold interacted with me as an object. A dangerous object requiring careful management, but an object nonetheless. Blackmore saw me as a tool for advancement. The guards saw me as a curiosity or a threat. The other servants saw me as Blackmore's property, something to be maintained like expensive livestock. Only Taretha saw me as someone. She told me about her own life, her own constraints. Her father was indentured to Hold through debts he could never repay. She had been born into servitude as surely as I had been born into slavery, though the terms were different and the treatment less brutal. She had dreams of leaving, of seeing the world beyond Lord Eron's farmland. But those dreams were as impossible for her as they had once seemed for me. In sharing this, she was making us peers. Two beings trapped in different ways, but sharing the fundamental condition of confinement. "Do you ever imagine what you would do if you were free?" she asked me once. I was 12. She was 15. We sat in the small garden behind the servants' quarters, where she was supposed to be, hanging laundry, and I was supposed to be... I cannot actually recall what I was supposed to be doing. Some small moment of stolen time. "I do not understand the question," I replied. Not because I was being difficult, but because I genuinely did not. Freedom was not a category I possessed conceptual access to. "Free to do what?" "Anything," she said, as if that explained it. "If you could choose your own purpose, your own life, what would you choose?" I thought carefully. Every answer I could conceive still involved warfare, combat, military service. Because those were the skills I possessed. Those were what I had been shaped to do. Even in imagination, I could not escape the fundamental architecture of my training. "I do not know," I finally admitted. The admission felt like failure, like revealing a weakness, but Taretha did not mock or correct. She simply nodded as if my answer was expected, reasonable. "Maybe that's what freedom is," she said. "Not knowing, having to figure it out yourself." The concept was alien but compelling. That purpose might not be something assigned, but something discovered. That not knowing could be a beginning rather than an ending. I carried that conversation with me through months of subsequent training, turning it over in my mind during those moments when exhaustion made thought difficult. If freedom was uncertainty, then certainty was imprisonment. And I lived in absolute certainty about my purpose, my place, my future. Which meant, by Taretha's framework, I lived in absolute imprisonment, despite my developed abilities, despite my education, despite everything Blackmore claimed was privilege. Taretha also taught me, inadvertently, about the performance required of the oppressed. She spoke differently when her father was present, her voice softer, her opinions fewer. She moved differently when Blackmore was near, made herself smaller, less noticeable. She had learned, as I had learned, to read the room and adjust her presentation to minimize danger. The difference was that she knew she was performing. She could distinguish between her authentic self and the version she presented for survival. I had never made that distinction. I had no concept of an authentic self separate from the trained self. I was the performance all the way down. "How do you know which thoughts are really yours?" I asked her once, after observing her shift from her private voice to her servile voice mid-sentence when a guard approached. She looked at me with that sad expression again, that mourning for something I could not see. "The thoughts you have when you're alone," she said, "when there's no one to punish you for them. Those are yours." But I was never truly alone. Even in my locked cell, even in silence, Blackmore's training was present. His voice was present. The expectations, the corrections, the constant evaluation. There was no space in my mind not occupied by the architecture of my conditioning. If authentic thoughts were those unpolluted by external authority, then I possessed no authentic thoughts at all. That realization should have been devastating. Instead, it was clarifying. Because if I had no authentic self, then I had nothing to lose. If I was entirely constructed, then I could potentially be reconstructed. The foundation could be examined, questioned, perhaps even rebuilt according to different principles. Not immediately, not obviously, but theoretically. Possibly. The possibility alone was revolutionary. There is a paradox in questioning your conditioning that I did not anticipate. The doubt itself was uncomfortable, generated anxiety that my training had never prepared me to manage. My training had prepared me for physical pain, for exhaustion, for facing death. It had not prepared me for uncertainty about my own foundational beliefs. That uncertainty created a specific form of suffering that was in some ways worse than the beatings and deprivation I had been taught to endure. So part of me wanted to return to certainty, wanted to stop questioning and simply be what I had been trained to be. The questions made everything harder. They turned routine training into ethical evaluation. They transformed simple obedience into complicity. They made me responsible for choices I had previously been able to attribute entirely to authority. Certainty, even certainty in servitude, was more comfortable than this constant internal examination. I began to understand why the orcs in the camps looked so hollow. Perhaps it was not that they had been broken by defeat. Perhaps they had been offered the same choice I now faced: consciousness with its attendant suffering, or unconsciousness with its peace. Perhaps they had chosen peace, chosen to stop being fully present in their own existence because presence hurt too much. I could do the same. I could stop reading Taretha's books, could stop noticing the contradictions, could immerse myself so completely in training and obedience that there was no space left for doubt. It would be easy. Easier than continuing to question. Easier than carrying the weight of awareness that my entire existence was someone else's design. Blackmore, in his own way, offered me this escape. He began drinking more heavily, his control deteriorating as I aged and grew stronger. His training sessions became less structured, more simply brutal. Where before there had been method behind the violence, now there was often only the violence itself. He would strike me not to correct technique, but because I was present and he was angry. He would scream contradictory orders: attack, stop, defend, advance. Not as tactical instruction, but as chaos that required me to interpret his actual intent through his inebriation. This deterioration could have simplified everything. I could have classified him as simply a cruel drunk, dismissed his teachings as the ravings of a failing man, could have waited for him to destroy himself through his appetites, as he clearly was doing, could have told myself that nothing he had taught me mattered, because the teacher was fundamentally broken, but I could not, because some of what he had taught me was genuinely valuable. The combat training was effective, the tactical education was sound, the discipline, even if its application had been brutal, had given me capabilities I would not otherwise possess. To reject everything because some of it was corrupt felt like the same kind of binary thinking I was trying to escape. The world was not divided neatly into pure good and absolute evil, valid teaching and worthless indoctrination. It was mixed, contaminated, complex. I needed to be able to hold multiple truths simultaneously. That Blackmore was cruel and that he was effective, that my training was oppressive and that it was educational, that I had been robbed of choice and that I had developed capabilities. This was harder than holding to any single truth. It required constant evaluation, constant adjustment. It required accepting that my own life did not fit into simple categories, could not be reduced to straightforward narrative. At 13, I was already larger than most full-grown humans, stronger than any of Durnhold's guards. I could kill Blackmore easily. This fact was obvious to both of us. During his drunken rages, I sometimes saw him realize it mid-strike, saw the flicker of fear cross his face as he recognized the disparity in our physical capabilities. I could end him, end my captivity. But then what? I had nowhere to go. No knowledge of the world beyond Durnhold's walls that was not filtered through Alliance propaganda. No connection to other orcs except my observation of the Hollow Ones in camps. No sense of identity separate from the one I had been assigned. Freedom without purpose, without direction, without identity felt like simply a different form of captivity. More frightening because it was vast rather than confined. So I stayed, not because I could not leave, but because leaving felt impossible despite being physically simple. The chains were no longer external, but internal. I had been so thoroughly trained to need structure, to require purpose assigned by authority, that removing the external authority did not grant freedom. It only revealed the emptiness where my self-determination should have been. This, I think, is the true genius of effective oppression. It does not require constant physical restraint. It only requires training the oppressed to restrain themselves, to internalize the boundaries so completely that removing the external barriers changes nothing. The prisoner continues to behave like a prisoner, even when the cell door is opened, because the real prison is inside his own mind. Change, when it came, was not dramatic revelation or sudden rebellion. It was accumulation. The weight of small doubts and minor questions building until the structure that contained them could no longer hold. I was 14 when Blackmore ordered me to train against one of the camp orcs. He had arranged to have one transferred to Durnhold specifically for this purpose, a former warrior who retained enough physicality to provide challenging combat practice. The orc arrived in chains. He was larger than me, his body bearing the scars of countless battles, but his eyes were empty in that characteristic way. He did not resist the guards, did not acknowledge me when we were placed in the training yard together, did not react when Blackmore ordered us to fight. I attacked as trained, efficient, controlled strikes designed to test his defense. He did not defend. He simply stood there, taking the blows with no reaction, no pain, no anger, no fear. Nothing. I stopped, disturbed by this absolute passivity. Blackmore screamed at me to continue, to strike harder, to force the orc to respond. I tried. I hit him hard enough to break bone, struck him across the face with my full strength. He fell, and then slowly, mechanically, stood up again, still empty, still absent. "You see," Blackmore shouted triumphantly, drunk and gleeful, "this is what they are. Nothing. Shells. You are special, Thrall, because I made you special. Without me, this is what you would be." But I did not see that. I saw an orc who had been defeated so thoroughly that he had surrendered consciousness itself as the final defense against suffering. I saw not proof of orcish inferiority, but evidence of what systematic cruelty produces. I saw what Blackmore would have made of me if circumstances had been slightly different. If I had been older when captured, if I had experienced enough of Orcish culture to have something to break. And I saw that I was looking at my future. Not the hollow passivity, but the role Blackmore intended for me. I would be his intermediary. His weapon aimed at these broken orcs, controlling them through whatever means necessary, while he profited from that control. I would become the face of oppression for my own people, the enforcer of the system that had caged us both. I would be complicit not just in my own enslavement, but in perpetuating that enslavement for others. The orc stood there waiting for me to strike him again, and I could not. Not because of squeamishness or moral revelation, but because I saw the pointlessness. There was no combat happening here, no real training, only the systematic demonstration that power could render beings into objects. Only Blackmore's need to prove to himself that his control was absolute. I dropped my weapon, turned to Blackmore, and said the most dangerous thing I had ever said: no. The silence that followed was total. The guards, the servants, everyone present froze. Because I had never refused a direct order, never. In 14 years of training, I had questioned technique, had suggested alternatives, but I had never simply refused. The word hung in the air like a severed rope, all the tension that had been pulling me forward suddenly released. Blackmore's face went through several colors. Red with anger, white with shock, then red again with rage compounded by alcohol. He drew his sword, not a practice blade, but a real weapon, sharpened and deadly. And he advanced on me with clear intent. I could have killed him then, should have, by every tactical assessment I had been trained to make. He was drunk, slower than his normal speed, attacking in a straight line with no technique. I was trained, sober, vastly stronger. The outcome was predetermined in my favor. I stood there and made a choice. Not to fight back, not to defend myself with lethal force, to simply stop participating in the dynamic that had defined my entire existence. He struck me. The blade cut across my shoulder, deep but not fatal. I did not counterattack. He struck again, this time across my chest. Still, I stood there. The guards were shouting but not intervening, confused about what they were witnessing, uncertain if this was some new form of training or genuine breakdown. Blackmore raised his sword for a third strike, aiming for my neck, clearly intending to kill me despite years of investment, despite all his plans, simply because his control had been questioned. Taretha tackled him. This small human girl, throwing herself at an armed, enraged man 3 times her size. It was suicidal and pointless, and perfectly in character for her particular form of courage. She did not stop him, but she distracted him long enough for other servants to restrain him, to pull him away, to end the moment before it ended me. I stood there bleeding, watching this chaos I had created through one simple word. And I understood that everything had changed. Not because I had fought back, but because I had refused to fight at all, because I had removed my participation from Blackmore's design, and in doing so had revealed that design's fundamental dependency on my cooperation. They locked me in my cell, not as punishment but as containment, as if I had become suddenly dangerous despite my passivity. Taretha came later with bandages and medicine, risking severe punishment to tend wounds her father's master had inflicted. "You were going to let him kill you," she said, not a question but an observation that demanded explanation. "I was not going to kill him," I replied, which was not the same thing but was the only explanation I had. If I killed him, I would prove everything he taught me about Orcish violence. I would become the weapon he wanted to create. So I chose not to participate in that creation. "That's insane," she said, but her tone was not condemning, more awed. Frightened for me, but also recognizing something in my choice that she understood intuitively. Perhaps, I agreed, but it was my choice. The first real choice I have ever made, and that means something, even if the choice was insane. She finished bandaging my wounds in silence. Before she left, she pressed something into my hand. A key, the key to my cell and to the postern gate in the fortress wall. "You cannot stay here," she whispered. "He will kill you. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but he will kill you because you have shown him that he does not own you, and that is something his pride cannot survive." "I have nowhere to go," I replied, the same objection I had repeated to myself countless times. "Then you will figure it out," she said. "Like I told you, that is what freedom is, not knowing and discovering anyway." She left, and I sat in my cell with a key in my hand and a choice before me that was genuinely mine to make. I waited 3 days before using the key, not from fear or indecision, but from strategy. Blackmore was being watched by his superior officers, following his public attack on valuable property. The fortress was on alert. Leaving immediately would be expected, would result in pursuit, would end with my recapture or death. So I waited. I continued my routines as if nothing had changed, attended training sessions with guards who had replaced Blackmore's direct oversight, ate my meals, returned to my cell each night. On the 3rd night, I used the key. The fortress at night was different from its daytime configuration. Quieter, darker, the familiar corridors transformed by shadow into uncertain territory. I moved through them with the stealth training I had practiced countless times, avoiding the patrol patterns I had long ago memorized. The postern gate was unguarded, a minor exit used for waste disposal and servants' access. It opened onto a steep hillside that descended toward the forest surrounding Lordomere. I stood at the threshold for a long moment. Behind me was everything I knew, the structure that had defined my existence, the certainty of my purpose, even if that purpose was oppressive. Before me was absolute uncertainty, a world I had been taught to view only through the lens of military tactical analysis, now presenting itself as lived territory I would have to navigate without orders. I stepped through. The door closed behind me with a sound that was both final and liberating, and I began to run. The night was cold, but not freezing. Spring was approaching, the air carrying hints of thaw and growth. I ran south, away from Lordomere, toward the forests of Hillsbrad. I had no specific destination, no plan beyond distance and concealment. For the first hours, I simply ran, driven by the need to create space between myself and Durnhold to make pursuit difficult through pure physical distance. By dawn, I was deep in forest territory I had only seen on maps. I found a stream, drank deeply, examined my surroundings with trained tactical assessment, defensible positions, sight lines, escape routes. The training was automatic. I could not turn it off even when its purpose was no longer to serve Blackmore but to preserve myself. In that moment, I understood that escaping physical captivity did not mean escaping the mental structures that captivity had created. I was still thinking like a weapon, analyzing terrain for combat advantage rather than simply experiencing the forest as a place to exist. I tried to stop, to simply sit and observe without tactical framework. The trees were tall pines, their needles creating soft ground cover. Birds moved through the branches, wind rustled leaves. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt empty. Because without tactical purpose, without mission parameters, I did not know what I was supposed to feel. Joy, relief, fear. All of these emotions were appropriate, but I could not access them. I could only observe that I should be feeling them and note the absence where feeling should be. This was what Blackmore had done. Not just trained my body, but trained my consciousness itself to operate according to specific patterns. To evaluate everything through frames of combat utility and tactical advantage. To experience reality as a series of problems requiring solutions rather than as simple existence. Even my escape from him was being executed according to his training. I was still following his conditioning even in the act of fleeing it. The frustration of this recognition was sharp and surprising. I had thought freedom would feel different, would feel like something. Instead, it felt like continuation of captivity under slightly different parameters. I was still alone, still without connection to anything beyond myself, still operating according to structures I had not chosen and could not easily dismantle. I spent 3 days in that forest, learning the basics of survival without support systems. I had been taught to forage, to find water, to build shelter. The training served me well, but it also highlighted how thoroughly I had been prepared even for this. Blackmore had imagined scenarios where I might need to operate independently for extended periods. He had prepared me to survive alone because he expected I would do so in service to his purposes. Now I was surviving alone in defiance of those purposes, but using the exact skills he had provided. The irony was almost funny. Almost. On the 4th day, I encountered other orcs. They were a transport convoy moving north. 20 orcs in chains being relocated between internment camps. The guards were bored and inattentive, not expecting trouble. Orcs did not escape. They did not rebel. They simply existed in their hollow passivity while being moved from one pen to another. I watched from concealment, hidden in the forest above the road. These were my people, my species, and I felt absolutely no connection to them. They were as alien to me as they had seemed from Durnhold's walls. More alien, perhaps, because I could see them clearly without the filter of Blackmore's commentary. They were not naturally violent, not reduced versions of warriors. They were simply broken, defeated so thoroughly that they had abandoned selfhood as a defense mechanism. One of them looked up toward my hiding place. Our eyes met across the distance. His were brown where mine were green, but the shape was the same. The facial structure was the same. We were kin by any biological measure, and yet I felt no kinship, no recognition of shared experience. Only the tactical assessment that he posed no threat, and the deeper recognition that I did not know how to feel about my own species. The convoy moved on. I let them go. What would I have done if I had freed them? 20 orcs who could not or would not fight, who had no destination or purpose beyond the containment that had been imposed on them. I would have been freeing them into the same void I now occupied, the same purposeless freedom that felt less like liberation and more like abandonment. But I followed the convoy anyway, maintaining distance, observing, because even without connection, they represented something, my species, my biological identity, the category of being I belonged to, even if I did not understand what that belonging meant. The convoy reached its destination before nightfall, a new internment camp recently constructed to accommodate the redistribution of captive orcs following the closure of some older facilities. The camp was a study in efficient oppression, high walls, minimal guard presence because minimal guard presence was needed. The orcs were not trying to escape. They required no elaborate security. They policed their own captivity through their complete lack of will. I watched from the forest as the new arrivals were processed, sorted, assigned to specific pen areas within the larger enclosure. The procedure was mechanical. The guards treated them like cargo, valuable enough to require care but not valuable enough to require respect. And the orcs accepted this treatment with absolute passivity. No resistance, no complaint, no visible reaction at all. One guard, young and apparently new to this posting, made a comment I could hear even from my distance. "Are they always like this?" he asked an older guard. "Like what?" the veteran replied. "Like nothing. Like they are not even there." The older guard shrugged. "Defeated, broken, call it what you want. This is what happens when you crush a species completely. They stop being a species and start being a problem of logistics." The young guard seemed disturbed by this answer, which suggested he retained some capacity for empathy that his service had not yet eliminated. "Seems wrong," he muttered. "Seems necessary," the veteran corrected. "They invaded our world, remember? Burned our cities, killed thousands. This peace is the price of their defeat. If you cannot handle that, request a transfer. But do not expect sympathy for orcs." No one who lived through the wars will give it to you. The exchange clarified something for me. The camps were not simply practical containment, they were punishment, revenge enacted through the slow grinding away of consciousness itself. The Alliance was doing to the Horde what the Horde had done to them, only slowly, systematically, with the veneer of mercy, because they were permitting the Orcs to live. But this life was not mercy. It was a different kind of death. Death of self while the body continued to function, and I was expected to serve as an instrument of this policy, to command these hollow shells on behalf of human interests, to perpetuate the system that had created them. The recognition of this expected future made me physically ill. I vomited in the forest, my body rejecting the understanding before my mind had fully processed it. I had escaped Blackmoor, but I had not escaped the role he intended for me. That role existed, independent of his physical control, embedded in Alliance policy, in the structure of the camps, in the simple fact of my training and capabilities. Whether he specifically commanded me or not, I was positioned to become exactly what he had designed, unless I chose otherwise. But choosing otherwise required knowing what I was choosing toward. Rejection of Blackmoor's purpose did not automatically generate alternative purpose. And I was beginning to understand, there alone in the forest, watching my people exist in hollow captivity, that I was still operating within the same framework I was trying to escape. I was still thinking in terms of purpose, of function, of role. I was still defining myself by what I was supposed to do rather than by what I wanted to do, or even by what I simply was. What was I without purpose, without training, without the structure of expectations that had shaped every moment of my existence? I did not know. I had no reference point for existence without mission parameters. Taretha had tried to teach me this. Freedom as not knowing, as the space to discover, rather than the certainty of assigned function. But not knowing required tolerance for ambiguity I had never been permitted to develop. My training had eliminated ambiguity. Every situation had correct responses based on tactical doctrine. Every question had answers I had been taught to recite. The uncertainty I now faced was not tactical but existential, and I had no doctrine for navigating it. I spent another week in the forest, not hiding exactly, more existing without direction, learning what it felt like to wake without a training schedule, to move through the day without objectives, to make choices about basic things, where to sleep, what to eat, which direction to walk, based on nothing more than preference or curiosity. It was harder than any training I had endured, because the training, however brutal, had provided clarity. Pain with purpose is bearable. Uncertainty without purpose is its own form of suffering. During this time, I thought about the orc in the training yard, the one I had refused to strike. I had saved him nothing. He had been returned to the camps after Blackmoor's rage subsided, returned to his hollow existence. My refusal had been meaningful only for me, had changed only my own relationship to Blackmoor's authority. It had not freed the other orc, had not even registered in his vacant consciousness as a moment of significance. This was the limitation of individual resistance. It could define the self but could not necessarily change the system. I had rejected my assigned role, but that rejection did not automatically undo the circumstances that had created that role. The camps still existed. The broken orcs still suffered their empty existence. Blackmoor still pursued his ambitions, likely with another orc selected for training, another being molded into the weapon I had refused to become. My freedom, if I could call it that, was purely personal. It saved only me. And I was beginning to understand that saving only myself might not be enough, might not justify the capabilities I had developed or the resources that had been invested in my creation. I had been made into a weapon. Refusing to be Blackmoor's weapon did not unmake that reality. It only meant I had to decide independently how that weapon would be employed, or if it would be employed at all. I considered walking away entirely, disappearing into the wilderness, finding some remote region where neither Alliance nor Horde had presence. Living out my existence alone, harming no one, serving no one. It would be honest, simple, the ultimate rejection of the purposes others had tried to impose on me. But it would also be waste, and I had been trained too thoroughly in efficiency to accept waste easily. I had capabilities most beings did not possess, knowledge that could be valuable, strength that could be utilized. The question was not whether these things existed, but how they should be directed. On the 9th day of my wandering, I found another camp. This one was different, smaller, more remote, less systematically maintained. The orcs within showed more awareness than those I had observed before. They were not warriors, not actively rebellious, but they were present, aware of their surroundings, responsive to each other. Human guards were present, but fewer, less attentive. I watched for 2 days before understanding the pattern. This camp was being neglected. The Alliance administration was consolidating facilities, closing remote camps in favor of larger, more efficient operations. These orcs had been forgotten in the transition, left with minimal oversight, minimal resources. They would likely starve or succumb to disease before official policy remembered their existence, and they were doing nothing about it. Even with reduced guard presence, even facing death, through neglect, they remained passive. Whatever had broken them remained broken despite the loosening of immediate constraints. I could leave them, should leave them by any reasonable assessment of my own interests. Getting involved meant revealing my presence, potentially drawing Alliance attention, definitely complicating my own situation. The tactical choice was clear: maintain concealment and continue my flight. But I did not make the tactical choice. I entered the camp at night, simply walking through the gate that was locked but unguarded. The orcs watched me approach with something resembling curiosity, more expression than I had seen from captive orcs before. I stood in the center of the compound and waited for some kind of response. Finally, one spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, his common broken and heavily accented. What you want?" It was the first time I had heard another orc speak in my presence. The voice was different from human voices, the tones slightly lower, the cadence unfamiliar. It should have felt like connection. Instead, it felt like meeting aliens who happened to share my physical characteristics. "I am here to observe," I replied in common, because I knew no other language. "You are dying. You do not resist. Why?" The speaking orc looked at his companions. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Then he turned back to me. "You, young, you not remember. Remember what? The blood, the fury, the demons." He struggled with the words, searching for concepts his degraded common could express. "We were monsters. We killed, we burned. Then demons left, and we, nothing. Just tired. So tired. Always." This was new information, different from the Alliance version that described orcs as naturally violent. Different from Blackmore's teachings about inherent savagery. This orc was describing the lethargy as a consequence of losing something not as natural state. Losing the demonic corruption that had driven the original Horde. "So you choose to die now?" I asked. "Not choose, just accept. What else?" "You could escape," I pointed out. "The guards are few, the walls are not that high. You could leave." "Go where?" the orc replied. "Do what? We are done. We had purpose, war purpose, now no purpose, just waiting." I understood then what I was seeing. These orcs were not broken by defeat, but by the removal of the corruption that had given them false purpose. The demonic influence had driven them, unified them, given them direction, even as it twisted them into tools of destruction. Without that influence, they had collapsed into purposelessness, lacking any internal framework for self-direction because the demonic control had replaced whatever cultural structures they had originally possessed. They were like me, shaped entirely by external force, left empty when that force was removed. "You need new purpose," I said. "Not a suggestion, but an assessment." "What purpose?" the orc asked. And in his voice I heard genuine question, not rhetorical despair, but actual inquiry. He wanted an answer. I did not have one. I was still figuring out my own purpose, still navigating the void left by Blackmoor's absent authority. I could not give these orcs direction when I had none myself, but I could give them something else. Something that might matter more than specific purpose. "The purpose of surviving," I said, "of existing beyond this camp, of discovering what orcs can be without demons, without human masters. That is purpose enough to begin." The silence that followed was different from the empty silence I had observed in other camps. This was active consideration. These orcs were thinking, evaluating, actually processing my words rather than letting them wash over vacant consciousness. "You speak like human," another orc said. "You dress like human. Why you care what we do?" "Because I am orc," I replied, the words feeling strange. It was the first time I had claimed that identity directly, without qualifier or apology. And I was raised to serve humans, to command orcs on their behalf. I have chosen not to fulfill that purpose, but I do not yet know what purpose replaces it. Perhaps discovering that together is possible. Perhaps not. But remaining here to die is certainly failure. I expected argument, expected resistance or apathy or continued despair. Instead, the first orc simply nodded. "Then we go. But you lead. We forgot how." That was how I became a leader. Not through inspiration or charisma or grand vision, through being slightly less broken than those around me, through having just enough training and direction setting that I could provide structure for those who had lost all structure, through accepting responsibility not because I wanted it, but because refusing it would mean allowing preventable death. We left that night. 14 orcs, including myself, walking away from the neglected camp toward... I did not know. I had no destination, no plan beyond not here. But that was enough for now. Enough to move forward. Enough to begin. The forest accepted us. We moved carefully, using stealth and concealment Blackmoor had taught me, extended now to group movement. The other orcs followed my directions with mechanical precision, still lacking initiative, but responsive to clear commands. We were not yet a community, barely even a group, just individuals moving in coordination towards survival. During our flight, I learned pieces of their stories. Most had been warriors in the old Horde, had participated in the atrocities Blackmoor had described, though they remembered those actions through fog, as if someone else had performed them using their bodies. The demonic corruption had not controlled them directly like puppets, but had amplified their aggression, suppressed their empathy, twisted their cultural values toward destruction. They remembered being themselves while also being not themselves. The contradiction haunted them. "We did terrible things," one admitted as we rested beside a stream. "Killed children, burned homes, laughed while doing it. I remember laughing, but it was not my laugh, not my joy, but my hands, my blade, my choice, even if choice was twisted." This was the question at the heart of orcish existence in this new age. Were they responsible for actions taken under demonic influence? If the influence had twisted them but not eliminated their agency, then they remained morally culpable even if diminished. But if the influence had been so complete that they could not be considered fully themselves, then the current punishment was unjust, penalizing them for crimes they had not truly chosen. I did not know the answer. I only knew that living in the permanent condition of collective punishment without path toward redemption was unsustainable. These orcs needed something beyond suffering for past crimes. They needed possibility, the chance to become something other than their worst moments. Blackmore had never taught me how to provide that. His training had been about control, about using others as instruments. But these orcs needed something different. They needed to rediscover their own agency, their own capacity for choice, their own ability to define purpose rather than having purpose imposed on them. So I began teaching them what Taretha had tried to teach me, the skill of not knowing, the practice of choosing without certainty, the acceptance that purpose was something to discover rather than something to receive from authority. It was harder than combat training, much harder. We had been traveling for 2 weeks when one of the orcs asked my name. The question was simple, but it stopped me completely, because I did not have an orcish name. I had a designation, Thrall, meaning slave, given to me by my captors. Using it meant accepting their definition of my identity. But I had no alternative. No memory of what my parents might have named me. No connection to whatever naming traditions orcs possessed. I was called Thrall, I said, the admission tasting like defeat. The orcs reacted with visible discomfort. One made a gesture I did not recognize, something like warding off evil. That not name, he said firmly. That curse. That what masters call those who own. You not owned now, need real name. I do not know my real name, I admitted. I was taken as infant. My parents were killed. I do not know what they called me or what I should be called. The orcs conferred in what I assumed was their own language, speaking too quickly and in idioms I could not follow even if I had understood the basic vocabulary. Finally, the eldest among them turned back to me. In old tradition, before demons, names were earned, given by deeds or by characteristics recognized by clan. You have no clan, but you have deeds. You freed us. You lead us. You teach us to choose again. That is deed enough for name. What name would you give? I asked, uncertain how I felt about this. Names should be chosen by self or given by family. Having virtual strangers name you seemed wrong, yet I had no family, and the self I was still discovering had no name to offer itself. Goal, the elder said, means stranger who brings help in old tongue. Means one who arrives from outside. That is you. You are not of us, because you are not broken as we were broken. But you are with us. You help us. Goal. Goal. The syllables felt foreign in my mouth. Strange. But they also felt less like a curse than thrall, less like an identity imposed by oppression, and more like an identity offered by those who knew oppression. It was not perfect, but it was mine in a way Thrall had never been. Goal, I repeated, testing the sound. I will accept this name. Thank you. The elder nodded, satisfied. But I noticed he did not tell me his own name. None of them had. When I asked why, his answer was sobering. We gave up names in the camps, he explained. Names are for persons. We became not persons, just numbers. Just orcs. Using names felt like lying, like pretending we were still who we had been before demons, before war, before breaking. Maybe someday we earn names again, but not yet. Still too broken. This broke my heart in a way Blackmore's cruelty never had, because Blackmore's cruelty had been external, something done to me. This was internal damage, self-inflicted erasure that persisted even after the external cruelty had ended. These orcs had been so thoroughly dehumanized, de-orcified, that they could no longer recognize their own personhood. They saw themselves as the Alliance saw them, as problems, as numbers, as defeated enemies, rather than as beings worthy of names. You will have names again, I said, making it a promise rather than a hope. All of you. When you are ready to accept them, when you can believe you deserve them, you will have names again. They looked at me with something approaching faith. It was terrifying, because I had no idea how to fulfill that promise. I barely knew how to help them survive day to day, let alone how to reconstruct their shattered sense of self. But I had made the promise, and that meant I was committed to attempting the impossible. We continued south, away from Lordemir, away from the internment camp's highest concentrations. I was leading now, not just coordinating. The other orcs looked to me for decisions about direction, timing, tactics. I made those decisions based on Blackmoor's training, on the maps I had memorized, on tactical doctrine I had internalized. I was using the tools of my oppression to facilitate our escape from oppression. The irony was not lost on me. But I was also learning to make decisions based on other factors. On the needs of the group, on the emotional state of orcs still recovering from long captivity, on the simple recognition that efficiency was not the only value that mattered. Sometimes we stopped to rest, not because tactical doctrine dictated it, but because someone was struggling. Sometimes we took longer routes because the direct path would have required traveling through populated areas that would have been psychologically difficult for orcs still terrified of human contact. This was not the leadership Blackmoor had taught me. This was something different, something I was discovering through necessity and observation rather than through formal instruction. It was harder than combat command. Combat had clear objectives and definable success criteria. This leadership required constant evaluation of competing needs, constant adjustment based on individual circumstances, constant acceptance that there was no perfect solution to complex problems. I was learning to lead not by commanding, but by serving, by recognizing that authority, without care for those under that authority, was simply oppression by another name. We had been free, or at least uncaptive, for a month when we encountered the frost wolves. They found us, really. We were attempting to hunt, poorly, our coordination still developing. I was stalking a deer with two of the former warriors when we were suddenly surrounded by orcs I had not heard approach. They were different from my companions. Harder, more present. Their eyes held intelligence and purpose rather than hollow defeat. And they were armed with real weapons, not improvised tools, suggesting they had maintained warrior culture despite whatever they had endured. Their leader was an orc of middle years, his face scarred but his bearing confident. He regarded us with evident confusion, as if we were a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. "You are from the camps," he said. Not a question, but an assessment delivered in common, but with the accent of someone more comfortable in orcish tongues. "We were," I replied carefully. "We left. We seek. We do not know what we seek, only that we could not remain where we were." "You are young," he observed, looking specifically at me. "Too young to remember the wars. Yet you lead these elder warriors. How?" "They needed someone to lead. I had training, that is all." "Training from whom? You speak common like native. You move like human warrior, but you are clearly orc." I explained, briefly, Blackmoor, Durnhold, the training, the escape, the discovery of the neglected camp. I expected judgment, expected rejection or perhaps pity. Instead, the leader's eyes widened with something like recognition. "Durotan," he said quietly. "You are of Durotan's line. I see it now in your face, in your bearing. Your father was my chieftain before his murder. I am Drekthar, elder shaman of the Frostwolf clan." The words made no sense. I had no father except biologically, no clan except the group I had accidentally assembled, no history beyond what Blackmoor had provided. But Drekthar insisted, explained, told me about parents I had never known, a clan I had never belonged to, an identity I had never possessed. Durotan had opposed the demonic corruption, had refused the blood pact that bound most of the Horde to the Burning Legion, had tried to save the orcish people from the fate they had chosen. For this, he had been killed as a traitor by forces loyal to Gul'dan. My mother had died with him. I had been taken, presumed dead or lost. The Frost Wolves have survived in hiding, Drekthar explained. Free but isolated. We rejected the demon blood. We reject the camps. We maintain the old ways as best we can while waiting for the possibility of something better. But we are few, and we grow fewer each year. Young orcs born in hiding, raised without cultural continuity, uncertain of their own identity. He was describing the same void I felt, the absence where culture and belonging should be. I had filled that absence with Blackmore's training and then with the desperate attempt to help other broken orcs survive. But it was still absence, still empty space where something fundamental should reside. You could come with us, Drekthar offered. Return to your clan. Learn what it means to be Frostwolf. To be orc, not defined by demons or by humans, but by our own traditions, our own values. It was a generous offer, exactly what I should have wanted. Connection to my biological heritage, to a community that could teach me orcish identity from a foundation of freedom rather than captivity. But accepting it would mean abandoning the broken orcs I had been leading. They could not come with me. The Frost Wolves were in hiding specifically to avoid Alliance attention. Taking 14 former camp orcs would compromise that security. I looked at my companions. They were watching this exchange with evident hope. Hope that I would accept, would find my place, would be saved from the uncertain exile we had been navigating. They wanted me to be free, even if it meant their abandonment, because that was what they had been taught, that their own needs did not matter compared to the needs of those who were less broken, more worthy. I cannot, I said to Drekthar. Not yet. These orcs need leadership while they remember how to lead themselves. I cannot abandon that responsibility simply because better circumstances present themselves. Drekthar studied me for a long moment. Then he smiled, a rare expression on an orcish face still marked by decades of war and hiding. You are your father's son, he said. He also chose responsibility over comfort, duty over safety. That choice killed him, but it was a worthy choice. Is that supposed to be encouraging? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. No, Drekthar admitted. Only true. But truth is worth more than comfort. The Frost Wolves will remember you, Goel, son of Duratan. When you are ready, when your responsibilities permit, you will be welcome among us. They departed as silently as they had arrived, leaving us alone again. But now with the knowledge that other possibilities existed, that orcs could live free, could maintain culture, could be something other than broken shadows of demonic corruption. It did not solve our immediate problems, but it proved that solutions were theoretically possible. That we were not simply prolonging inevitable defeat, but working toward genuinely different futures. That night, I told my companions about the encounter in more detail. About Duratan and Draka, about my heritage, about the possibility that somewhere orcs maintained existence beyond Alliance control. I expected envy or resentment that I had been offered escape while they had not. Instead, I found pride. They were happy that their leader, their Goel, had clan and history and possibility beyond the present struggle. You should have gone, one said firmly. You should learn your people. You are my people, I replied. The ones who gave me name. The ones I am responsible for. Drekthar's offer will remain, but you need me now. We do, the elder admitted, but that is our weakness, not your obligation. You choose to stay. That is gift. But do not confuse gift with debt. You owe us nothing, Goel. You freed us. We already have more than we deserved. The statement reflected their broken self-perception. They still did not believe they deserved names, dignity, or consideration. They still saw themselves through the lens of Alliance judgment, as defeated enemies whose survival was charity rather than right. Changing that perception would take more than words. It would require sustained demonstration that they possessed worth independent of past crimes or present utility. It would require rebuilding an entire civilization's sense of self. And I, raised as a weapon by the civilization that had destroyed them, was somehow supposed to facilitate that rebuilding. The task was impossible, but refusing it was unacceptable. So I continued forward into impossibility. One day at a time, one decision at a time, learning as I went how to lead beings toward a future none of us could clearly imagine. What Taratha had tried to teach me, I was now trying to teach these broken warriors. The skill of choice, the practice of self-determination, the uncomfortable process of living with uncertainty while building new structures of meaning. But I was a poor teacher, still learning these concepts myself, still struggling with the contradictions between my training and my emerging values. We established a camp in the remote hills south of Hillsbrad, hidden in a valley that offered defensibility and concealment. I taught them what I could. Combat skills they had forgotten, tactical thinking they had lost, practical survival techniques. But I also tried to teach them to make decisions without waiting for commands, to express preferences rather than accepting any circumstance, to argue with me when they disagreed rather than assuming authority was always correct. This last proved hardest. They had been broken by absolute authority. They did not know how to respectfully question without feeling they were returning to the rebellion that had led to their defeat. I tried to model the distinction. Questioning specific decisions was not rejecting general authority. Individual disagreement was not treason. Criticism of methods was not betrayal of purpose. Slowly, painfully, they began to relearn these skills. One argued with my choice of campsite, suggesting a location with better water access. Another questioned my training schedule, noting that rest periods were too short for proper recovery. A third challenged my tactical assessment of how to respond to a nearby Alliance patrol, proposing an alternative approach that proved more effective than my own plan. Each time, I made a point of acknowledging the contribution, of implementing the better idea, of demonstrating that challenging authority could lead to better outcomes rather than punishment. It was exhausting. Every leadership text Blackmore had forced me to study assumed authority should be absolute. Questioning should be eliminated. Obedience should be reflexive. I was trying to teach the opposite while still maintaining enough structure to keep us organized and alive. The former warriors began to show personality, individual preferences, humor, frustration, hope. They were becoming people again rather than empty vessels. It was beautiful and terrifying because it meant they could be hurt again, could suffer loss again, could be broken again. Emptiness was safer, but emptiness was not living. One evening, 6 months after our initial escape, the elder approached me with something resembling nervousness. He held a small carved figure, a wolf rendered in wood with surprising skill. "I made this," he said, stating the obvious, but with evident pride. "I was carver. Before war, before demons, before camps. I was carver for clan, made totems and decoration. I forgot. I thought I forgot everything from before, but hands remember. Look." He showed me his hands. They were scarred, misshapen from years of fighting and neglect. But they had created this wolf, this beautiful thing that served no tactical purpose, that had no survival utility, that existed simply because he had wanted it to exist. "This is for you," he said, "because you give us back selves, not immediately, not completely, but started. You started process of us becoming persons again, that deserve gift, that deserve name. I am Rehgar. That was my name before I became number. I am Rehgar again." I accepted the carved wolf, the gift, the name, all of it. And I understood that we had reached a threshold. The process of recovery was not complete, would likely never be complete, but it had progressed beyond survival into actual living. These orcs were reclaiming their identities, their purposes, their right to exist as something other than defeated enemies or empty vessels. "Thank you, Rehgar," I said, using his name deliberately, honoring the reclamation it represented. "I will keep this. to remember that even broken things can be made beautiful again. Others followed Rehgar's example over the following weeks. They reclaimed names, disclosed skills they had abandoned, began projects that had no purpose beyond personal expression. We were becoming a community rather than simply a group of survivors. Not yet a clan, we lacked the cultural continuity for that, but something, a beginning. I continued training, continued developing my own skills while teaching theirs, continued learning to lead not by commanding but by facilitating their rediscovery of agency. And I thought often about Thrall's words, about my father who had chosen responsibility over safety. I was beginning to understand what that choice meant. Not noble sacrifice or heroic martyrdom, but simply the recognition that some responsibilities could not be set aside even when keeping them was difficult, even when alternatives presented themselves. I was not yet the leader the Frost Wolves needed or that the Horde might someday require. But I was learning, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one impossible task at a time. And the weapon Blackmore had created was slowly becoming something he had never intended. A person who chose his own purpose, defined his own meaning, and accepted responsibility not because he had been trained to, but because he believed it was right. That choice, more than any combat skill or tactical knowledge, was the real education that mattered.